We're going to continue our conversation about the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 by starting with a historical lens. As I mentioned in the previous segment, it's important to understand that the No Child Left Behind Act is not a new piece of legislation. It's a reauthorization of a longstanding piece of legislation. And the longstanding piece of legislation is called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. This piece of legislation is supposed to be reauthorized in the United States every 5 years. And I'm going to be talking today very briefly about one other reauthorization of ESEA prior to the No Child Left Behind Act, and then I'm going to go in more detail about the No Child Left Behind Act. So the 1994 reauthorization of ESEA, which is called the Improving America's School Act, something that was passed during President Bill Clinton's administration, I believe provides a kind of important foundational lens that then I'll talk about in more detail when we talk about the 2001 reauthorization, which is the No Child Left Behind Act. But the kind of important takeaway is that the No Child Left Behind Act is not a standalone, which is often assumed that it is, and that it builds on, in important ways, kind of momentum of previous reauthorizations. And in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about IASA. So to begin with the original piece of legislation, this is actually a really important piece of legislation, federal legislation around public schooling in our country. And the reason is because prior to 1965, the federal government didn't really have a deep investment strategy or a targeted investment strategy for public education. And so in important ways, ESEA really established the federal government's role in public education funding in the country. It was passed under President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration as part of the War on Poverty. And it really was the largest and most comprehensive education law or piece of legislation that the federal government has ever passed relative to public education in our country. In that respect, even though the reauthorizations are significant, like IASA, like the No Child Left Behind Act, the kind of meat and bones of what is in all of these different reauthorizations starts with this original piece of legislation. And what it did was very simple, actually. It provided targeted resources to particular populations, students of color, disadvantaged students, disabled students, poor students. And basically, the federal government said, our role in legislating and funding public education is going to be around sending resources, particularly for those populations, wherever they go to school. So this piece of legislation in 1965 was landmark and critical in that it defined in important ways federal intervention and federal funding in public education in the United States. There are a lot of other reauthorizations in between the 1965 version of this legislation, but I'm going to fast forward us to 1994, to Bill Clinton's administration and the Improving America's Schools Act. And the reason I'm doing this is because in some respects, I think this reauthorization, the 1994 reauthorization, paved the way for what was going to become the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. What it did is it asked schools to maintain a certain set of standards associated with receiving funding for these targeted populations. So for the first time, the federal government put a stake in the ground and said, you actually do have to hold the same standards for all students. Prior to this, the original piece of legislation and the reauthorizations that came before 1994 actually didn't ask states and localities to have the same set of standards for low-achieving students or low-income students as for middle and upper-class students or white students. So it didn't actually specify that there had to be equal standards for everyone. The other thing that this reauthorization did is it targeted or focused on accountability for achievement for students. And so it said you do have to use a set of annual standardized tests or assessments to measure student progress in your state or in your locality in order to be eligible to receive federal funds. So in some respects, while this wasn't as extensive as what we'll see in the No Child Left Behind Act, I would argue that this was laying the foundation in important respects for what would happen when the No Child Left Behind Act was constructed. So then enter the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. It has several different kind of components and foundational tenets. Again, this is a piece of legislation that is hundreds of pages long, and so what I'm giving you is a very short summary, but you also can actually access the full piece of legislation and great summary documents that can help you to understand it better. But I'm going to give you just the high-level summary of what it did. It came with a set of increased accountability, so building on the specifications of the 1994 reauthorization and actually getting even more specific in terms of the accountability features, the grade levels that were required to be tested, the kind of growth that had to be achieved, et cetera. It also focused on more choices for parents and students. So saying low-performing schools are unsafe schools, if your student goes to those kinds of schools, you are eligible to choose to go someplace else. It increased flexibility in funding, so federal funds that came targeted for particular students for particular purposes. The No Child Left Behind Act essentially said, if you can comply with the accountability measures that we are putting into place, if you can hit those requirements in terms of measuring progress, then we will allow you to use those federal funding streams in a more flexible way. It also put a stake in the ground around literacy for in early childhood in particular for kindergarten through third grade students, and sending a funding stream around interventions in literacy. And then there were a set of other kind of changes that were marked by these same themes around accountability, choice, and flexibility. So that's going to end this kind of summary historical lens segment of the No Child Left Behind Act. And next, we're going to go into a deeper summary of the No Child Left Behind Act in particular.